Comrades, let us begin with a truth so sharp it cuts through every illusion society has wrapped around you. The world moves only because you move it. Every building that rises, every machine that hums, every system that claims authority, none of it exists without your labor. Yet you stand in a world where the fruits of that labor are seized by those who contribute nothing but their hunger for profit. This is not an accident. It is the design of the system that governs your life. You have been taught to believe that power lies in wealth, in ownership, in the hands of the employer, the banker, the ruler. But I tell you today, power resides in labor itself. Power resides in you. And from the moment you understand this, the ground beneath the ruling class begins to shake. Labor is the true source of all power and wealth in society. For without the activity of human hands and human minds, nothing of value could ever come into existence. Every object, every tool, every structure, every comfort that modern society takes for granted is the crystallized effort of countless workers whose energy is embedded in the world like an invisible foundation. It is not the capitalist who forges steel, who cultivates the land, who transports goods across continents, who programs machines, who constructs cities, who keeps the lights burning and the factories humming. It is the worker whose daily expenditure of effort animates the entire economic system. Even the technologies that seem to operate independently of human touch are the congealed results of years of scientific labor, collective knowledge, and collaborative innovation. No commodity exists that has not been shaped, at some stage, by human labor. No wealth exists that has not been extracted from the productive capacities of living people. This truth becomes obscured only because the system intentionally hides it. Capitalism depends upon mystifying the origin of wealth, attributing it to the brilliance of entrepreneurs, the generosity of investors, or the efficiency of markets. But such narratives collapse the moment one asks who actually performs the work. A machine does not operate itself. A field does not cultivate itself. A factory does not spontaneously generate products. Even the most sophisticated automation requires human design, human maintenance, human oversight, and human labor at earlier stages of production. The capitalist contributes none of this. He contributes only ownership of land he did not create, ownership of machines he did not build, ownership of wealth extracted from workers before him. Ownership gives him authority not because he produces, but because the system legally grants him control over the labor power of others. Yet despite this, society praises the capitalist as a creator and treats the worker as a cost to be minimized. This inversion of reality is central to the functioning of the economic order. The worker is taught to believe that wages are a reward for labor, when in truth wages represent only a fragment of the value the worker creates. The remainder, far greater in magnitude, is seized as profit. Profit does not arise from investment or risk, it arises from the unpaid portion of labor. It is the silent appropriation of the worker's life energy, the hidden transfer of value from those who produce to those who merely claim ownership. When we say labor is the source of all wealth, we do not speak metaphorically. Every surplus, every accumulation, every expansion of capital rests upon the difference between what the worker produces and what he receives. If labor is the source of wealth, it follows that the worker is the true force sustaining the entire structure of society. The laborer's strength, creativity, skill, discipline, and endurance constitute the real engine of economic life. Without the worker, capital is inert. Without the worker, markets freeze. Without the worker, value cannot be created. The worker, however, cannot simply withdraw from the system, for his own survival is tied to the wages he is forced to accept. Here lies the contradiction at the heart of modern society. The very class that produces all wealth remains dependent upon those who produce none. This dependency is maintained through economic coercion, ideological conditioning, and political structures designed to protect the rights of property over the rights of people. But beneath this imposed dependency remains a fundamental truth. All power flows from labor. The ability of the ruling class to command society is rooted in their control over the labor of others. When workers cease to labor, power shifts instantly. A strike reveals more about the nature of society than any textbook. Production halts, profits vanish, and the illusion of capitalist authority dissolves. The worker who feels powerless alone becomes an unshakable force when united with others. For once labour withdraws, the entire edifice of wealth collapses into stillness. Thus, labour is not merely the source of economic value, it is the source of social power. The organisation of labour determines the shape of civilization itself. The level of development in any era reflects the abilities, cooperation, and creative potential of its workers. And the future will be shaped not by the ambitions of capitalists, but by the collective strength of those whose hands sustain the world. Capitalism survives by stealing the value created by workers, a process so deeply woven into the fabric of everyday life that it often becomes invisible even to those who suffer from it most directly. At the heart of this system lies a simple exchange. The worker sells labour power for wages, and the employer purchases this labour to generate profit. On the surface, this appears to be a fair trade, but beneath the appearance of equality lies a structural theft. The worker is paid less than the value he produces, sometimes vastly less, and the surplus, the difference between what he creates and what he receives, is appropriated by the capitalist as profit. This is not an occasional injustice or an accidental imbalance. It is the core mechanism through which capitalism functions. Without this extraction of surplus value, the system could not exist for even a single day. The worker comes to the workplace with the only asset he possesses, his capacity to work. The capitalist, however, owns the tools, the machines, the land, the factory, and the means of production. Because the capitalist owns these things, he also controls the conditions under which labour takes place. He commands the worker's time, dictates his output, and claims ownership of whatever the worker produces. Yet it is the worker who animates the machinery, the worker who transforms raw materials into commodities, and the worker whose effort generates new value. The capitalist contributes nothing comparable to this process. His profits arise not from his personal labour but from the unpaid labour time of his employees. It is during the portion of the workday in which the worker produces more value than the cost of his own wage that exploitation occurs. This unpaid portion is the source of capital, the lifeblood of accumulation. Capitalism hides this exploitation behind the language of contracts, wages, and job opportunities, all of which imply that the worker should be grateful for employment. But employment is simply the legalized structure through which the capitalist gains access to the worker's productive powers. The worker must accept this arrangement because he does not own the means of survival. He must sell his labor power or starve. This coercive relationship is masked by the illusion of free choice. Yet the choice between work and hunger is no choice at all. The freedom celebrated by capitalism is the freedom of the worker to choose his master, not to escape exploitation. What the capitalist calls profit is merely the monetary form of this stolen labor. The more efficiently exploitation is carried out through speed-ups, longer hours, wage suppression, technological discipline, or global outsourcing, the greater the profit. Capitalism rewards those who can extract the most value from workers while paying them the least. It praises this as innovation, entrepreneurship, or competitive strategy. But in reality, it is an organized system of appropriation. Entire industries depend on driving wages down, minimizing protections, and intensifying work. The capitalist must constantly expand exploitation to survive, for profit is not a luxury but a requirement. Without continuous accumulation, the capitalist enterprise collapses under the weight of competition, debts, and market pressures. Thus, exploitation is not a moral failing of individual capitalists. It is the logical necessity of the system itself. Even the advancements of technology, often celebrated as evidence of capitalist progress, become tools for deeper extraction of value. Machines reduce the worker's control over the labor process, speed up production, and increase the amount of value generated in each hour. But the gains from this increased productivity do not flow to the worker. They flow upward into the hands of those who own the machines. The worker becomes more productive, yet more impoverished, for his increased output only strengthens the system that exploits him. What appears as technological triumph is in truth the extension of the capitalist's ability to command and extract. The theft at the center of capitalism does not end in the factory, it permeates society. The institutions that appear neutral, education, law, media, finance are shaped to justify, normalize, and protect this extraction. Schools teach obedience and prepare workers for their role in production. Laws safeguard private property and criminalize resistance. Media celebrates wealth and obscures the labor that produces it. Finance turns exploitation into numbers and expands its reach through debt. Every element of society is organized to preserve the process by which value is taken from those who create it and delivered to those who own. Yet despite all this concealment, the truth remains unchanged. The wealth of the world is created by workers, and the appropriation of that wealth by capitalists is the foundation of the economic order. The system survives not because it is fair or efficient, but because it is built on a continuous stream of stolen value, extracted day after day from millions who receive far less than they give. Workers remain oppressed because they are divided, not powerless. For the true strength of the working class has always resided in its collective capacity rather than in the isolated efforts of individuals. The system understands this more clearly than many workers themselves, which is why it invests so heavily in creating, maintaining, and deepening divisions among those whose shared interests should naturally draw them together. These divisions are not spontaneous. They are engineered, cultivated through economic competition, political manipulation, and social fragmentation. When workers see each other as rivals rather than allies, they weaken the very force capable of challenging exploitation at its root. The power of the ruling class does not rest on its numbers or its moral authority, but on its ability to keep workers disorganized, suspicious of one another, and unable to act as a united force. Capitalism thrives on competition, and it extends this principle far beyond the marketplace. Workers are pitted against one another from the moment they seek employment. They compete for jobs, for wages, for promotions, for survival. This competition is presented as natural, as a reflection of human nature, yet it is manufactured by the economic conditions in which they are placed. Scarcity is not a neutral reality, it is a deliberate outcome of a system that limits access to resources for many while concentrating wealth among a few. The worker internalizes this scarcity and begins to perceive other workers as obstacles to his own well-being. Instead of recognizing the employer as the source of his hardship, he sees his fellow laborer as a rival. This inversion serves the capitalist perfectly, for no master fears an isolated worker. What he fears is solidarity. National boundaries, racial distinctions, linguistic differences, gender roles, and religious identities become tools through which the ruling class divides the workforce. These differences exist in society, but under capitalism they become weapons. Workers are told their interests align not with those who share their position in the economic order, but with those who share superficial traits. They are encouraged to distrust workers from other countries, even though those workers suffer under the same global exploitation. They are encouraged to resent immigrants, even though immigrants labor under conditions shaped by the same employers and laws. They are encouraged to view women, minorities, or marginalized groups as competitors for limited jobs, even though all are subjected to the same extraction of value. In each case, the worker's anger is redirected away from the system that exploits him and toward those who should be his allies. The capitalist benefits immensely from these divisions. A divided workforce cannot strike effectively, cannot negotiate collectively, cannot challenge authority with strength. When workers are fragmented, they face the employer as isolated individuals rather than as a class. The employer can easily replace one worker with another, secure in the knowledge that workers will not unite to demand better conditions. This creates a perpetual vulnerability, a sense of insecurity that keeps workers obedient and hesitant to rebel. The fear of losing employment becomes greater than the desire for justice, for the worker feels he must protect his own position in a hostile environment. But this hostility is not inherent. It is constructed through the system's manipulation of scarcity and division. The irony is that while workers remain divided, the ruling class is profoundly united. Employers collaborate through industry associations, lobbyists, trade agreements, and legal structures that protect their collective interests. They coordinate strategies, share information, and act with unified purpose to maximize profit and suppress challenges. Their unity grants them immense power, while the disunity of workers ensures the continuation of exploitation. The result is a society in which the many serve the interests of the few, not because the few are stronger, but because the many have not yet recognized their common strength. Yet the potential for unity is always present, for the conditions that workers face are shared across boundaries. Their struggles stem from the same source, their exploitation follows the same logic, and their liberation requires the same collective action. When workers have overcome their divisions, even briefly, history has shifted. Strikes, uprisings, and movements have revealed the extraordinary power that emerges when workers recognize that their interests are aligned. In those moments, the illusions of division dissolve, and the ruling class trembles before the realization that its authority is far more fragile than it appears. Workers are not powerless. They are the creators of all wealth, the backbone of production, the force without which society cannot function. Their power becomes visible the moment they withdraw their labor or raise their voices in unison. Oppression persists not because workers lack strength, but because that strength lies dormant, fractured by the lines capitalism draws between them. The path to liberation is not found in individual effort or competition, but in unity, solidarity, and the recognition that workers share a common enemy and a common future. Real liberation requires collective organization, not reform, because reform is designed to patch the cracks of a collapsing system rather than dismantle the structure that produces exploitation in the first place. Reform offers the illusion of progress while preserving the foundations of inequality. It promises to soften the sharpest edges of oppression without altering the underlying relations of power. A wage increase today is eroded by rising prices tomorrow. A new law protecting workers can be overturned when profits are threatened. A temporary improvement in conditions can be reversed in the next economic downturn. Reform is the art of maintaining the appearance of change while guaranteeing that the system remains intact. Collective organization, on the other hand, confronts the roots of exploitation and seeks not merely to ease suffering but to end the conditions that generate it. The ruling class grants reforms only when pressured by organized resistance, and even then, only reforms that do not challenge their control over the means of production. They may concede minor adjustments to prevent workers from uniting more fiercely. They may present these concessions as generosity, as enlightened governance, or as proof that capitalism can be humanized. In reality, reform is a defensive strategy, a calculated measure to keep workers hopeful enough to endure exploitation but not empowered enough to overthrow it. As long as ownership remains in the hands of a minority, as long as labor continues to be commodified, as long as profit depends on extracting surplus value, no reform can deliver true freedom. Collective organization is the only force capable of altering these fundamental conditions. Workers acting individually confront the system with weakness. Workers acting collectively confront it with power. When workers organize into unions, councils, assemblies, and revolutionary movements, they begin to challenge not just specific injustices, but the entire framework that defines their lives. Through organization, they create a shared consciousness, recognizing that their struggles are not isolated incidents, but manifestations of a broader economic structure. This awareness transforms anger into solidarity and frustration into coordinated action. Only a united class can resist exploitation effectively, for the power of the ruling class rests not in its numbers, but in its control over divided workers. The very idea of organization terrifies the capitalist. A workforce that negotiates collectively cannot be easily manipulated. A community that understands its shared interests cannot be easily deceived. A class that recognizes its collective strength cannot be easily subdued. The ruling class knows that its authority crumbles when workers unite, which is why every effort is made to disrupt solidarity. Workers are encouraged to rely on personal advancement rather than collective struggle, to seek individual escape rather than shared liberation. Yet true liberation cannot be attained by individual success stories that leave the system unchanged. The worker who rises within the hierarchy does not free his class, he merely leaves them behind, becoming part of the machinery that oppresses others. Reform also reinforces the illusion that the system can adjust itself to meet human needs. But capitalism cannot be reshaped into something humane because its driving force is profit, not human dignity. Every reform that threatens profitability will be resisted, undermined, or reversed. The system cannot prioritize workers' rights over capital accumulation without ceasing to function as capitalism. Thus, reform always stops short of addressing the real problem, the domination of labor by capital. It offers relief but not emancipation, progress but not transformation, compromise but not justice. Collective organization offers what reform cannot, a direct challenge to the ownership structure that lies at the root of exploitation. Through organization, workers can assert control over production, reshape economic priorities, and build structures that serve human needs rather than profit. Organization is the means through which the working class develops the ability to govern itself, to manage resources collectively, to build institutions grounded in equality rather than hierarchy. It transforms workers from objects of policy into subjects of history. The strength of collective organization lies not only in its ability to confront the ruling class, but in its capacity to transform the workers themselves. Through shared struggle, they develop discipline, courage, and solidarity. They learn to trust each other and to recognize their common interest. They shed the individualistic illusions that capitalism fosters and discover their collective identity as a class. In this transformation lies the seed of a new society, one built not on exploitation but on cooperation, mutual reliance, and shared power. Reform may offer temporary comfort, but it leaves workers vulnerable to the next crisis, the next exploitation, the next betrayal. Collective organization builds the foundation for enduring liberation by confronting the roots of inequality and empowering workers to shape their own destiny. Reform adjusts the chains, organization breaks them. Reform stabilizes exploitation, organization seeks to end it. Reform preserves the system, organization transforms the world. When workers realize their power, they become an unstoppable force of transformation. For the strength they possess is not merely numerical but structural, rooted in the very foundations of society. Every institution, every industry, every mechanism of daily life depends on their labor. The moment workers awaken to this truth, the illusion of capitalist authority begins to crumble. The ruling class maintains dominance not through inherent superiority, but through the ignorance and division of those who produce the world's wealth. When workers understand that the continuation of society relies entirely upon their collective effort, the balance of power shifts dramatically. What once appeared as an immovable system reveals itself as fragile, dependent on the silent compliance of millions who could withdraw their support at any moment. This realization does not arise spontaneously. It emerges from experience, struggle, and the growing awareness that individual grievances are part of a larger structure of exploitation. Workers begin to see that their hardships are not personal failures, but consequences of an economic order designed to keep them in subordination. They discover that the problems they face, low wages, long hours, job insecurity, rising costs, diminishing rights, are shared across industries, regions, and nations. In recognizing the universality of their suffering, they start to recognize the universality of their power. A worker alone feels small, but a worker who sees himself as part of a class millions strong begins to understand the immense force that lies dormant in collective action. Once workers grasp their collective power, the ideological chains that bind them begin to fall away. The myths that justify exploitation, that workers are replaceable, that employers are benevolent providers, that economic conditions are natural and unavoidable lose their grip. Workers start to question authority, to challenge the legitimacy of those who claim ownership over the products of their labor. The structures that once appeared invincible reveal their dependence on obedience. The workplace, the economy, the government, and the entire social order appear in a new light, as systems built not on fairness or necessity but on the organized extraction of value from those who create it. In this awakening, fear begins to shift sides. The ruling class, long confident in its dominance, senses the emerging threat. Workers who understand their power become unpredictable, resistant, emboldened. They speak differently, walk differently, and act with a new clarity. They form alliances, build organizations, and engage in collective struggles. They refuse to accept the conditions imposed on them and begin to articulate visions of a different world. The capitalist knows that a conscious working class is the most dangerous force in history. For once awakened, it cannot be easily subdued, divided, or deceived. When workers act on this realization, the material impact becomes immediate and undeniable. A strike halts production, disrupts profits, and reveals the dependence of capital on labor. A coordinated movement can bring industries, cities, or entire nations to a standstill. The capitalist's power evaporates the moment workers refuse to participate in their own exploitation. The workplace, which once felt like a site of domination, transforms into a potential arena of collective resistance. The flow of capital, which seems abstract and uncontrollable, is exposed as a process that workers can interrupt, reshape, or reclaim. Through collective action, workers turn their social position into a weapon capable of transforming the entire economic order. This transformative power extends beyond economic struggle. When workers recognize their strength, they begin to transform themselves. They acquire the courage that comes from standing together, the discipline that arises from coordinated action, and the confidence that emerges when fear gives way to solidarity. They develop a deeper understanding of society, of their place within it, and of the possibility of constructing a new world based on equality and cooperation rather than exploitation. This transformation of consciousness is as important as any change in material conditions, for a liberated class must first liberate its own mind from the ideological shackles of the ruling order. As workers gain confidence in their collective power, they begin to demand more than small concessions. They begin to demand control over the very processes of production. They challenge the legitimacy of private ownership over resources they collectively operate. They question why the wealth they create is used to enrich a minority rather than meet the needs of society. Their struggle expands from immediate demands to a broader vision of social transformation. The possibility of a new social order emerges not from utopian imagination but from the logic of collective empowerment. History shows repeatedly that when workers move as one, governments fall, economies are reshaped, and entire systems of power collapse. Workers become unstoppable not because they seek chaos, but because they seek justice. Their strength is not destructive but creative, for they carry within them the capacity to build a new society grounded in cooperation, dignity, and shared prosperity. When workers realize their power, they no longer ask for freedom, they exercise it. They no longer plead for rights, they claim them. They no longer hope for change, they become its engine.